We are in for a treat. Imagine having a front row seat to history, watching as leaders of nations met, deals were struck, and powerful bonds of diplomacy were forged. Leslie's remarkable career gave her just that and more. In her memoir, My Time with General Colin Powell, Stories of Kindness, Diplomacy, and Protocol, in that book and this presentation, she will share with us rare behind the scenes perspective of her 25 years alongside General Colin Powell, which, as we have heard from our members, one of America's most beloved statesmen. Leslie began her journey in protocol over 30 years ago, supporting presidential visits and representing the United States across the globe. Her path took her to the State Department, where she met delegations on behalf of President Reagan, and ultimately to her unique partnership with General Powell that we're going to hear about. As his right hand, Leslie orchestrated every detail of his high-profile speaking engagements and ensured he was prepared for each audience. Some of our members, as you heard, have heard him speak. And since 1996, whether we knew it or not, Leslie was there. We first met Leslie when she attended a Golden Gate Breakfast Club program to hear Marshall Terrell, who will be jumping in any minute now, when he discussed his book on Elvis and the Colonel. At some point, we have all wondered, what would it be like to be a fly on the wall in some of these circumstances? Throughout the pages of her book and her time with us, we're going to hear some of the stories about her time that nobody else knows about, unless you've already read her book. She saw Colin Powell from behind the scenes and the headlines, and we've invited her to tell us about the highlights from her life and book. Please welcome the author of My Time with Colin Powell, Leslie Lautenslager.
Number one, thank you so much for having me. I am delighted to be here. I will say that I will of course, you always thank the one who brought you. So when Marshall comes on, I will tip my hat to Marshall.
I'm here.
For those of you who don't know, he and I were classmates, or he's a year behind me in school, but we've known each other since we were teenagers. So it was a delight that he connected me with you all, and I am just delighted to be here. And I am thrilled to be able to share my stories, thrilled to be able to share my book. And I eagerly encourage you all to please run out, read it, share it with friends and family, and help me share the wonderful man that General Powell was. About 2 years before General Powell died, he would tease me and say, "Leslie, you got to write a book." And I would get in my prim and proper protocol high horse and say, "Yes, sir, I will write a book one day, and it'll be about protocol." And he would exaggerate, a yawn, and he would roll his eyes dramatically, and he'd say, "But Leslie, you got to write about me. You want it to sell, don't you?" I was with him for 25 and a half years. Most of that time was taking care of him on his professional international speaking circuit career. And then when we were at the State Department, or when he went to the State Department Secretary of State, he brought me with him. And I was the Assistant Chief of Protocol for ceremonials and Special Assistant to the Secretary of State. And all that meant is that my staff and I took care of everything he did in honor of a chief of state, head of government, foreign minister, diplomatic corps. So the luncheons and the dinners and the receptions and the ceremonies, that was my task and my staff's task. And then after State Department, we then, of course, went back on the speaking circuit. But in that 25 and a half years, so much of underwriting everything I did was to protect his privacy. So the idea of writing anything about him or his family was abhorrent. But then, about a year, almost to the week after he died, I came full circle and realized that not only could I write about him, not to do so would be unforgivably selfish and inexcusably wrong, because I knew this wonderful man from behind the scenes. The world knew him as the revered military leader or the revered diplomat and an international advocate for youth and children. But I knew him as so much more. I mean, yes, he was wonderful as this and this, but I also knew he was hysterically funny. He was a stand-up comedian. He was tremendously kind. He loved hot dogs. He loved ABBA. He can outsing you on any song by ABBA. He loved cars. He rebuilt cars all the time, and he was a wonderful family man. But he just was tremendously kind, and he was one where, unlike some people in the public eye, he was one who trusted his troops, trusted the people around him, and enabled anybody around him to be able to say, the emperor has no clothes. You know, if he was wrong, he wanted you to let him know. And whoever the guest is who knows Maura Hardy, I'm sure you've heard plenty of stories from Maura, but he was tremendously inclusive of his trusted lieutenants, and whether or not he was in military uniform, and you really were his trusted lieutenant, or you were little Leslie. Um, you know, anybody who was within his inner circle became an extension of him, and we were enabled to share him and protect him and encourage him. But he truly was an incredible individual. When I would start working with clients on the speaking circuit, so the mortgage bankers, or whichever ones that you all in the audience talked about having attended his event, when I would start engaging with that organization, the National Association of XYZ, and I would talk to my counterpart. And I, early on in talking with so many of them, I could detect a sense of almost intimidation that that person was, oh my goodness, we're dealing with the great and glorious Colin Powell, the Elvis of the speaking circuit, so to speak. And after I would develop a somewhat of a rapport, I would on the phone finally say, you know what? Every wonderful thing you've ever heard about General Powell is wrong. And there would be this shocked silence. And after a pregnant pause, I would then whisper, he's even better. And it was a wonderful way to engage, but it was also a wonderful way that I could protect that person from being too uptight about, I'm going to misstep, misspeak, whatever. And I could encourage them, no, no, listen, I will take care of General Powell. You take care of your people. You take care of your leadership. And I will make you look good because you can, glide in, and know that he is going to come in and wow the crowd. But I started with him back in 1996. So it was April 1996. And my one of my first jobs out of college was at the State Department in the Office of Protocol. And before I fell into that particular job, I not certainly even knew what protocol was. But long complicated story, but I fell into this job and I suddenly found my niche, found what gave me joy, and found what became my career and my profession. And but I was a political appointee under Reagan. So after the Reagan administration ended, my job ended. But the chief of protocol for President Reagan and under Secretary George Shultz, Secretary of State George Shultz, the chief of protocol was Ambassador Lucky Roosevelt. And so for those of you who don't know who Mrs. Roosevelt is, um, she she was to this day was the longest serving chief of protocol the United States has ever had. Um, President Reagan first had Lenore Annenberg as the first chief of protocol, but after 6 months, Lucky Roosevelt became chief of protocol and continued through the end of the Reagan administration. And she was phenomenal, exactly what one would want a chief of protocol to be. But after those years, Mrs. Roosevelt, who has and she's living in beautifully vibrant at 95 here in Washington. But ever after, whenever she was doing something, she had a tendency to snap her fingers, and those of us who worked for her, she would dearie, as she would call us to help her with an event. And this was April of 1996, and she is a big opera fan. And so she was in charge of the Washington National Opera. And that month we were doing the gala welcome performance, welcoming Placido Domingo to head up the Washington Opera. So it was a grand and glorious black tie event, and the King and Queen of Jordan were invited, and we had the creme de la creme of Washington, D.C., and the arts and corporate America all there. And during the intermission, and I was tasked to help her with this gala. And during the intermission, there was a wonderful champagne reception on the terrace level outside the president's box. And as I'm going up the stairs with Mrs. Roosevelt, right in front of her was Mrs. Powell, Alma Powell. And a few steps away was General Powell. And General Powell had retired from the military in 1993. He had written his autobiography, which was an international runaway bestseller, had become very popular on the speaking circuit, and the eyes of the world were on him, and everybody wanted a piece of him. Everybody was just all over him, and it's funny, I will bring up Elvis again. Um, he in fact was the Elvis of the room. Everybody wanted to be a part of him. I just had eyes for Mrs. Powell. I just wanted to be able to meet Mrs. Powell because she, to me, embodied elegance and glamour and grace. And all things that I aspire to be when I grow up one day. Didn't want to meet him. Everybody else in the world wanted to meet him. I wanted to meet Mrs. Powell. Well, life goes on. The event was fabulous. Placido Domingo was welcomed. Lucky Roosevelt was delighted. Life goes on. I never did meet Mrs. Powell on that occasion. Again, I didn't meet General Powell either. And then 2 weeks later, out of the blue, I got a call from a friend of mine. It's your classic case, being at the right place at the right time, a friend of a friend. And I was told that there was this job at something called the Washington Speakers Bureau, and they needed somebody to take care of, in essence, what was the golden goose on the international speaking circuit. And they thought, my friend thought that I would be the right fit. Fast forward, um, almost instantaneously, I went in for an interview, was offered a job on the spot. And it's not that I had a military background, and it's not that I knew anything about General Powell, but they thought that we had two things in common that would mean we would be a good fit. Number one, we both had worked for President Ronald Reagan. And number two, even though I don't come from the military background, I come from a protocol background. And at least it was a commonality in terms of right and wrong, and a commonality in terms of how to do things properly, the importance of details, and the importance of a formality. And it was thought that that might be a good fit. Now, God bless General Powell, because the gentleman who had co-founded the Washington Speakers Bureau, when the person who'd been taking care of him on the speaking circuit had announced that she was leaving, they right away went to General Powell and said, "Listen, you know, and he's leaving. You tell us, we will hire whomever you want us to hire. You just tell us, just truly, you give us the person, we will hire the person." But General Powell said, "You know what? You have taken good care of me so far. I trust you to find the person." And it's purely because of that, because General Powell could have had anybody he wanted, but it was purely serendipitous that that it fell in my lap. But he and I did not have any idea we would fit. Certainly, we didn't think that I would be with him until he died, frankly. But at first, it was not easy going. This is 1996, which is long before we have cell phones and email. We would communicate by phone or, wait for it, by fax. So I would come into the office in the morning, and I would be a little bit big for my britches, pretty excited about how well the day before event had gone on the speaking circuit. The client had been over the moon delighted. I had my counterpart thrilled because I had made her look good to her bosses, and the general had seemed to be very pleased with how everything had gone. So I'd come into the office the next morning ready to get ready for the next event. And then in front of me on the fax machine would be a fax. On the top, it would say 2L2. My nickname was L squared, L2, from CP, Colin Powell, regarding RE, love notes. And then what would transpire for the next page or page and a half would be his telling me all the things I had done wrong. And going forward, thou shalt not do this. Going forward, we will do it this way. Going forward, no, Leslie, not that. And I like it this way. Don't do that. On top of everything else, it was in capital letters. Somehow or another, he had gotten by in life, and nobody had told him that typing in capital letters is shouting. So every morning, I got these evil love notes from General Powell. Well, fast forward 25 years, and that became a great lesson in leadership that we would pass on to anybody who would listen. It went on for like that for a couple weeks. And then then totally it stopped. But especially during COVID, when so much of, well, the whole world changed. And at the time, the speaking circuit was particularly decimated. But we could do speeches on Zoom. And so there would be organizations that would do, say, leadership retreats on Zoom. So it'd be like a senior executive of some organization or a bank or whatever would have their senior leadership lessons with General Colin Powell and be on Zoom. And sometimes the question would come up like, well, sir, you've had leadership positions in so many different realms of life. What were some of your techniques for training your subordinates and your aides? And General Powell would say, well, it's like this. It's the love note message. It's the love note method. And then again, as I said, this is in Zoom, and so we're doing this in his home office, which we called the bunker. It's the nicest home office you've ever seen, but we called it the bunker. And as he's on Zoom giving this presentation, I am just outside of the camera range, sitting beside him. And so as he's telling these executives, and they're taking notes fast and fiercely, they're learning leadership skills and lessons from the great and glorious General Colin Powell. So as he says, you know, let me tell you how I train my lieutenants, but better than that, let Leslie tell you. And so he would grab me and put me in front of the Zoom screen and let me go ahead and tell the story about the love notes on these fax machined all capital letters. And so we would play off, and I would grumble, and I would growl, and he could always play the stand-up comedian, and I was the straight man. And I could say, okay, frankly, I didn't like him very much because he was so awful with these love notes. And anyway, it was a great rapport. I mean, at the beginning, 25 and a half years, prior to then, it was painful. But in the end, the lesson to it was that he was such a masterful leader that the fastest way to get his lieutenants, his staff, his subordinates on the page with him, or as he said, to work in harmonic with him, It was to, from the beginning, get down in the details. I mean, down in the nitty-gritty that really the nitty-gritty didn't matter quite as dramatically as the shouted faxes said. But nonetheless, it was the fastest way to bring those lieutenants on board. And it really worked. But it was painful at the beginning. Um, in part of writing this book, I also acknowledge that I'm not a historian. I'm not a biographer. The world of historians and biographers and political pundits will forever and always write about General Powell. But my writing about him was really to share this wonderful man and the funny man. And so many of the chapters will have stories that will have you laughing out loud. And then by the end, you may want to grab a tissue, but I'll try to touch on a couple of the funny stories. I think we all would appreciate some funny stories today, every day, but maybe today an extra smile would be helpful. I blush very easily, and General Powell knew that and would have great fun making me blush when he could. He also knew that I was a big Tom Selleck fan. I have been in love with Magnum PI since the 1980s. Well, Tom Selleck and General Powell were friends. And we had an event once at the Ronald Reagan building, which for those of you who know Washington, D.C., Ronald Reagan building is a large building that has a lot of entities in it, but it also has some great venue space for big events. And there was this big black tie gala dinner. It was some congressional event that was honoring youth programs. And for this black tie gala dinner, General Powell had been invited to be a award presenter. Likewise, Tom Selleck had been invited to be an award presenter at the gala. And Mariah Carey was going to perform and various other people. No, anyway, we, as often happened, we would come to an event and we would start the event with a VIP reception. General Powell was a master of working a room. We could go into a VIP reception of 100 people. He could work the room, take time to greet all 100 people, and make all 100 people realize that they meant something to him and had a moment with him. And it was masterful. He just had a magic to him that he could do this so well. But the key was for me, once we worked the room, 100 people, my task was then to get him out of there because once he's met everybody, then it becomes a beehive and people want a piece of him. They want to hug him, they want to touch him, they want to camera phones, selfies, whatever. So we worked the room. It was time to escape, so we go across the hall to a hold room that had been reserved for the VIPs, basically the head table guests. So General Powell and I were just hanging out, and I mean we were close, so when we're hanging out, we could just literally hang out. But anytime then somebody else would come in, I then would play the protocol professional, which as Lainey can attest, we have a unique role in that we become the wallpaper. You know, it's not about us, it's we become the wallpaper. Well, General Powell, we've heard that now Tom Selleck has arrived, but Tom Selleck has no Leslie. So General Powell says, you know, Les, go save Tom. You know, ask him if he wants to come join us. So I go. I walk in, wade through the crowd, tap him on the shoulder. Mr. Selleck, excuse me, I'm Leslie Lautenslager. I work for General Colin Powell. He has asked, would you like to join us in the hold room? He, of course, is like lickety split, absolutely wants to get out of there because they really are, you know, beehiving him and driving him nuts. So I escort him across the hall. We're in the hold room, and again, I've now disappeared into the wallpaper. I am the wallpaper. General Powell and he are backslapping because they're old buddies and they're laughing and carrying on. Well, then we're joined by the other people for the head table, to include a woman who comes in and goes straight to General Powell, hugs and kisses him. Colin, yay! So happy to see you. He's responding in kind. She then goes on and proceeds to tell the rest of the guests, well, you know, Colin Powell saved my life. We were seated together at a White House dinner, and I got choked on chicken. And I mean, kidding aside, she did get, this is a true story. General Powell had told me this story many times. And she had gotten choked on chicken so dramatically that had somebody not saved her, she would have died. But she goes on and tells the story. She says, "Oh, Colin Powell saved me because I got choked on chicken at the White House, and he stood up and did the Heimlich maneuver and saved my life." So they're all laughing, carrying on. After they stop laughing, Tom Selleck says, "Well, I live in fear that one day I'm going to be someplace and somebody's going to die because I do not know how to do the Heimlich maneuver." A little twinkle goes off in General Powell's eye, and he hits Tom Selleck on the shoulder and says, "Tom, tonight's your lucky night. I'm going to teach you the Heimlich maneuver." And I knew what was coming because that twinkle in his eye, he snaps a finger. And again, I'm in the back. He snaps his finger and says, "Leslie, come here." So he proceeds to then make me stand, grabs Tom Selleck, puts Tom Selleck's beautiful arms around me, and says, "No, Tom, up, higher. No, 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 Tom, lower. No, 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 Tom, squeeze." So, of course, I am bright red because I am now dancing with my beloved Magnum PI. And General Powell was having a grand old time. Now, if anybody now ever hears that Tom Selleck has saved somebody's life with the Heimlich maneuver, you can say you now know the person who taught him the technique. So anyway, General Powell was great fun. I mean, he was always great fun. We worked tremendously hard. The whole time I was with him, it could be over the weekend, it could be any day of the week, any month of the year. Our mornings started between 5:45 and 6 o'clock. We would race each other to text with just a good morning. Excuse me. And then it ended every night with 11 o'clock as a text, um, as a night. And then we would talk throughout the day and whatnot. General Powell, unlike many people in the public eye, was one where he, as chairman, he was responsible for, I think, like 1 million people in uniform and their families. And as chairman, he also then had an entourage of like 90 people. These are his aides and his security and everybody in between. But as soon as he retired, he did not want an entourage. When he was Secretary of State, by regulation, the U.S. Government allows a former Secretary of State to retain diplomatic security for a full 6 months after leaving office. And for those who don't understand, people have a tendency to think that all security, all government official security is Secret Service. Secret Service is only the White House and Treasury. At the State Department, it is diplomatic security. But when General Powell left the State Department, he said, "Guys, ladies, you all have done a great, great job protecting me, but I'm retired now. I don't need protection. You have more important things to be doing than to follow me around in my home in McLean. I'm retired." So when he left, he did not want an entourage. After we were at State Department, his whole staff, 2 people, me being one of them, and the other one was a wonderful woman who took care of all his media. I don't do media, praise the Lord. Um, and she took care of all of his work on boards. He was on several boards, Bloom Energy, for those of you in the area around San Francisco, Bloom Energy and Salesforce. And it was like an apple and an orange. She took care of board work and media, and I took care of his international speaking career. And I took care of like anything having to do with Mrs. Powell and a lot of their social things. But that was the general. He was one who liked being a private citizen. He also, people were always surprised by the fact that he was not surrounded by security. I mean, I would tease and I would say, it's me. Well, clearly I don't look like security, and which is just always worth a laugh. But we had a way that we could work through a crowd, like walking through an airport in a crowd. As long as we kept moving. Now he had a baseball cap maybe, but as long as we kept moving and he didn't make eye contact, um, we had ways to communicate that could manage those crowds. As we're walking through an airport, I could say, okay, whispering, okay, you're 2 o'clock, which meant that I knew I had spotted somebody at his 2 o'clock coming towards us. And what I would then do is just slightly move my body to say, change position so that again, security, I'm not. And it's not that I could do anything if the person really wanted to do something, but at least it would stop the person in their tracks from, they'd have to go through me to get to him. Because people would be chasing us with camera phones, and I could usually just body block and have us move smoothly through a crowd without any fanfare. But people in the public eye, especially during the 21st century with social media, it's nuts. I mean, people would try to go. The only thing I couldn't do for him is when people tried to chase him into the men's room with a camera phone. I would body block outside the men's room door, but you know, clearly your mama did not read you right. If anything about that seems okay, to follow somebody into a restroom with a camera phone. But that's what life was like in in celebrity culture. It's crazy. When we would go into hotels, you all have probably heard of different celebrities have secret names for hotels. Well, we had secret names, and I always had the pleasure of being able to pick the secret names. And we would go, back and forth. The last secret name we had was it was a play on different characters in Dirty Dancing, but we also had um, different play on characters from The Hustler, which was one of his favorite movies, and play on different characters, Singing in the Rain, and so it was a constant thing. It was a secret for us. We also had our own um, signs, like a baseball umpire or catcher or whatever, touching an ear, touching my neck, touching my clock. In a crowd, it was a way that we could communicate. And if you go back and you pull up any recording of General Powell, um, look for the moment where he touches his ear. I mean, except for the fact that I'm telling you, you probably wouldn't have noticed it at the time. But if you pull it up, like anytime you see a recording of when he would do the National Memorial Day concert on the National Mall, there's a point where he touches his ear, and that's a sign to me. Now, granted, he had children and grandchildren, and certainly it was meant for them as well. But as children and grandchildren often do, like they don't care about Poppy, um, but I could always claim it. I would always know that this was his. Hey. And when we were in a crowd too, same way. He would get on a stage, I would disappear into the crowd, but we would make sure that early on we would make eye contact just to acknowledge to each other, I got you, I see you, and touch the ear. And again, that was our gift to each other. Gotcha, you're fine. We oftentimes he was so popular on the speaking circuit that oftentimes we would have to do back-to-back events that to get from one to the next required a private plane. He was a keynote speaker for a dinner speech in Tennessee on one occasion, and then was a morning plenary session keynote speaker after breakfast the next morning in New Orleans. So the only way to do it was by private plane. And in talking with, everything was fine in Tennessee. And in preparation, I had told my contacts in New Orleans that, listen, we're going to be arriving well after midnight. Please don't stand on ceremony for us. Oftentimes, clients wanted to stand on ceremony. They want to get the mayor there. They want to get their leadership there to do a motorcade or a welcome receiving line. And I would have to say, no, 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 listen, you all have more important things to be doing. Maybe you're meeting with your staff or maybe sleeping. I mean, don't stand on ceremony. We don't need to be, the general does not need to be, held on ceremony. So just make sure that we are pre-registered and our keys are waiting for us at the front desk so that we can come in and simply pick up our keys. Sure enough, we get in, it's like 12:30, 12:45. It's a convention hotel near the convention center in New Orleans. We come in the door. I throw the general behind a potted plant, which is what I would do just to keep him out of visual, and picked up the keys from the front desk. Everything was great. We go off to our rooms. Our rooms are beside each other. He is a little more adept at using his key card than I am, so he opens his door faster than I. We've said goodbye in the hallway. And as I'm opening my door, suddenly the general is tiptoeing backwards out of his room and says, "Leslie, there's a naked man in my bed." And I immediately grab him, throw him into my, oh, no, 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 actually, the first thing out of my mouth is he dead? The general, meanwhile, gives me a look like, "Leslie, you're an idiot." And which he gave me that look often. And he says, "Well, no, I don't think so. I think I saw his toe move, but uh, so okay, so I grab him and I throw him into my room. Don't move. Stay here." And I close the door. So I proceed down to the front desk and I do what we all know to do, or if you don't know how to do this, then please know from ever after, always going forward, if you have bad news to share, impart it first with something gentle. Don't drop the bad news right away. So I go to the front desk, and again, it's 1 o'clock in the morning now, and I say, "Everything is fine, but may I please have a new room?" And they look at me like, "Why? Why do you need a new room?" I said, "Well, no, Dutch, everything is fine, but please, may I have a new room?" "Well, Leslie, why do you need a new room?" "Because there's a naked man in General Powell's bed." And they went nuts. Now, they then started doing backflips trying to say, "But we just checked the room like 45 minutes before you got here and everything was perfect, everything was fine, and whatever. We don't know what happened." And again, trying to calm them down. Listen, number one, it's New Orleans. It could be a drunk conventioner. It could be a frat party. It could be a bachelor party. It could be just some random New Orleans person. It doesn't matter. Just please, may I have a new room? "Well, do you want us to take? No, 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 no. Leave naked man alone. General Powell has my room. Now, can you just let me have a new room?" So, sure enough, they give me a new room. I try to calm them down and listen, "It's fine. You're not in trouble. It's fine. Just..." So, anyway, the addendum to this story is, so the next morning when I then go to pick up General Powell to go to the plenary session and meet up with our contacts, I before we leave his room, my former room, it suddenly dawns on me that in this world of modern technology and social media and 21st century everything, I don't want to cross paths with Naked Man. Now, presumably he'd be with clothes right now, but I don't want to ever cross paths with him, because if in fact at any point he somewhat was in his stupor and somewhat saw General Powell in his room that night before, I would rather him think he had dreamt it rather than ever crossing paths with General Powell in the hallway, because it's nuts. Um, so anyway, those are just one of our many adventures on the road. We also had an event where we were going to be traveling first to London, or actually to Manchester, and then on to Asia. So where normally we would only travel with carry-on bags, in this case, we were going in two different climates in a long time, so we had to check our bags. But the first thing we were doing in Manchester was he was going to speak during the day, but then that evening we were going to a black tie event at a castle, a lesser nobleman, but a duke or earl's castle, black tie event. Well, it's one of those classic cases where every travel thing went wrong. And we were flying into London, but then we're having a small plane to go into Manchester and whatnot. We sat on the runway at Dulles for 6 bazillion hours, missed our connecting plane, which meant that our checked luggage went who knows where, and It was a black tie event, so tuxedo in his luggage. Now, ladies on this Zoom, you will appreciate this, and that our mothers all taught us correctly that one never packs their jewelry in checked luggage. So I had all my twinkly black tie jewelry in my carry-on, and I had traveled, my typical travel uniform was never the casual sweats that we so often see on planes these days. But I had a little a suit with black slacks and a little jacket, and I wore a silk blouse. So when we finally get to where he has to give the speech, he gives the speech beautifully, but our luggage has not found us again. And so going to that black tie event at a castle, I actually was able to fit in much more readily with the castle crowd than the general because I could shed my little jacket and with my just little silk blouse and my black slacks and just doing a little more magic to hair and makeup and put my twinkly jewelry on, I could blend. Whereas the poor general had to attend looking like he had slept in his suit in the plane, which he had. Now, again, if you're General Colin Powell, you can do this, and it becomes quite the charming addendum to the evening joy and became quite the laughing occasion. And he was like that. He just had great fun. He had a joie de vivre. And in my book, you'll see I actually referenced the joie de vivre in the very first preface part of the book, as well as one of the last sentences of the book. I talk about the joie de vivre that the general had. This timing, the timing of my being with you all actually is a very bittersweet timing. He died 3 years ago, October 18th. He was buried 3 years ago yesterday. Mrs. Powell died a few months ago, and of course, since she's buried with her husband at Arlington National Cemetery, it's quite a lengthy process. And her burial was just on the 24th of October, and we had a celebration of life for her on the 25th. So being able to share this marvelous, fabulous, tremendous man and memory, and even Mrs. Powell as well, is such a joy. And I am thrilled to have been able to be with you this morning. And I know I've been chattering. I've got 1,000 other questions, but I suspect that it's time that I should turn it over for Q&A. Is that correct?
Well, yes, that would be wonderful. And this is the idea of you throwing him behind a potted plant and finding naked men in his room. And of course, it's wonderful to hear these behind the scenes stories. That's fabulous. So, do you remember the questions that you had requested before we?
Yes.
Yeah, good. So,
Okay,
how
so
do you answer them?
I'll touch on the ones that I
Yeah.
think I picked up on several of y'all had variations on certain questions. And one of the things that I should tell you that too, he was a phenomenal speaker on the speaking circuit, and that several of you have mentioned having heard and seen him speak. And if you'll remember, he never ever used a written speech.
Mm.
Now, granted, when you're Secretary of State or Chairman of the Joint Chiefs or whatever, granted, you're going to have written speeches on those occasions separately. But on the speaking circuit, he just came out on a stage and wowed an audience. Now, part of that was he was a student always, and he was always doing homework, always trying to do everything he could to make himself smart, to know the industry he was addressing, know the occasion of the event, and know also the audience, what resonates with that audience. And then and part of that was as he was beating up on me to make him smart. And so I was then beating up on the client. Give me stuff to make General Powell smart about your industry, your audience, your event. And he was just tremendously talented that way. And then once the remarks were over, he would always do Q&A. And unlike many speakers, and I could name them all, and I could name many of them, unlike many speakers on the speaking circuit, he never, ever, ever wanted to know a question in advance.
Mm.
And as he would teasingly say, he said, "You pick the question, I pick the answer." But he never wanted to know a question in advance. And which was a wonderful skill set of his. I mean, he would do masterfully with that. But most places, I could almost recite verbatim the first three questions. It would be a variation of, why didn't you run for president? What would it take to make you run for president? Why aren't you president? I would have voted for you, whatever. So a variation on that theme was always a question. One of the first, if not the first questions he would ever take in a Q&A session. So to hear so many of y'all mentioned wanted to know that as well, it's not a surprise, and I'm happy to answer it. The bottom line is he didn't want it. He didn't want it. As he said, he he had a passion, he had a fire in his belly, to quote him, he had a fire in his belly for every moment he served in uniform. So for all, what was it 32, all 38 years, 2 months, 21 days, or whatever it was, every moment he served in uniform, he had a passion in his belly and knew that that was what he wanted. But when he retired, it was right after the Desert Storm, which suddenly had thrust him into the international public eye. And we were phenomenally successful with Shield and Desert Storm. Um, but when he retired as chairman, suddenly the world wanted him to be the leader of the free world. And he was courted by both parties. The Republicans wanted him to be the nominee, the Democrats wanted him to be the nominee. He had never had an interest in elected politics, but because the world was jumping on him about this, and leaders of all flavors um, were coming to him with that, he at least realized that he needed to spend considerable time to at least consider it. Maybe this was something that he should consider. So he talked to a lot of people he respected, people who were supporting the idea, people who were discouraging him on the idea, gave it all tremendous consideration, and actually shut down everything for a span of a week or 4 or 5 days, maybe a span of a week, like clear the dead of all appointments and really just hunker down at home. Talked about it with the family, of course. Um, And then one morning, when he joined Mrs. Powell in the kitchen, and over a cup of coffee, said, "Alma, I'm going to call the press today and I'm going to announce I'm not running." And Mrs. Powell said, "What took you so long? What took you so long?" She knew him that well and knew that down deep it was something he did not have an interest in elected politics. Now, he always said, "I will forever and always be able and want to serve my nation, but I can do that in many ways. It just does not have to include elected politics." Now, somebody was talking about having talked to Cokie Roberts, and other people had said it was Mrs. Powell said no, it wasn't that. It was a family decision. Now, yes, Mrs. Powell did not want him to, but it was not because Mrs. Powell said so. But the one story saying that he had 3 children and one of them was gay, that's not true. No, that's not true. I mean, he had gay friends and very supportive of gay rights, but his children, there's not anybody in the family is gay. Um, but in the end, it was not a fire in his belly. He just didn't want to do it. But it's funny. It's a question that was always brought up, and especially around election time, because we would all benefit from leaders like General Powell. I wish more of our leaders were like General Powell, and so many of them that we know from the past. But we can all learn from General Powell and some of the good folk who do seek public office. But it just was not something he wanted to do. One of the other big questions was about the UN speech. It's interesting when I was writing the book, and again, you'll remember my referencing Lucky Roosevelt, and she has always shepherded me in many things in my career and has me under her wing in many ways. And when she knew I was writing the book, and she adored General Powell and Mrs. Powell, but when she knew I was writing the book, she's like, "Dearie," which what she always said, "Dearie, you realize I was a journalist before I was chief of protocol. So, you know, come to my home and I will, you know, take a look." So I was brave enough to share 4 chapters with her in advance. I'm not crazy. I didn't really want to be, her red penning me for the whole um, book. But she had 2 things that um, she had some really great advice, but 2 main things that really were significant. And one of them was specifically, Leslie, this is great, but where's Mrs. Powell in this? Where's Alma in this? And she bluntly, graciously, but bluntly said, "Leslie, you are an unknown author. And, people are going to look at that and say, who's that chick? Who's this unknown chick? Where's Mrs. Powell in this book?" So I then it just happened that Mrs. Powell wasn't in those 4 chapters that I shared with her. But she said, "Well, make sure you articulate this in the preface. Make sure you articulate that you were close to the family." And I am, and I was close to the family. And so I do articulate that. And I was very close to Mrs. Powell, to include, I was very, the very ill in the celebration of life just now. Um, but her point was well stated, and I go into detail, and I go on to say that the book is sharing stories mostly focused on General Powell. I'm not sharing Mrs. Powell stories or the kids or the grandkids stories. This is General Powell. But I do cover that. So, and I also talked about the fact that my father died when I was 8. I was with General Powell for 3 times that time. Michael, the son, even refers to me as sister. So I established I'm very close to the family. Then Mrs. Roosevelt's other point was, okay, again, you are an unknown author, and any book about the general has to address the elephant in the room, the UN speech. But as I said, I'm not a historian, I'm not a biographer, and also I will tell you this too, I'm also a coward. I did not want to make this book something that then, if ever the book were such that would make it come in under, say a public viewing, I did not want to be chewed up by the crazy political pundits. But what I could do is it's a chapter towards the end called Joy and Sorrow. And that chapter is specific to February 5th, 2003. Now, February 5th, 2003 was, of course, the day he gives the speech at the UN about the weapons of mass destruction. His going into that speech is based on intelligence reports that have been shared from across all our intelligence services, international intelligence services. So the material he's been given and is tasked with presenting to the UN. So he's tasked to speak on behalf of the President of the United States to the UN as this is fact. Um, at that point, it was known to be what was known to be true. And at the end of that day, the headlines were, it was a great speech. It went well, the world is behind him and whatnot. It's weeks later that we find out that the intelligence was wrong. And the general, to his credit, acknowledged that and says, I was given, I presented information that was wrong. And I am sorry and forever sorry. But going into it, it was what he had to work with. But the reason I say is Joy and Sorrow, again, that day I turned 40. That day he gives the speech at the UN. And on our birthdays, his birthday is April 5th, and my birthday is February 5th. And so on our birthdays, we would always have special birthday traditions. We would start out, in that day in particular, he calls me from up in New York, and he sings happy birthday, sings loudly, happy birthday. I I give a little pep talk, go get them, troops, break a leg. I know you'll do great with the UN. The speech is, so important. Yay. And then, of course, the day goes on. He, after the speech, calls again, sings loudly, and um, and all is well. That's on a Tuesday, I think. And Saturday, I set that Saturday of that week, and we've gone through a snowstorm in Washington, D.C. Saturday that week, I have agreed to for some college friends. They wanted to give me a birthday dinner, and I sheepishly agree. I make them promise it's going to be a little dinner, 6 people, a little dinner. I don't want fanfare, a little dinner. So we, I get to the house in the snow, open the door, that little dinner of 6 people. Oh, no, no, no. The house is packed. 50, 60, 70, 80 people. Aunts, uncles, cousins from Richmond have come. High school, elementary school, college, career friends, family are all there. And it's a surprise party. After I work the room, I everybody is joyfully saying, well, no, go back to the entrance. I'll go back to the entrance. And the Secretary of State of the United States of America and Mrs. Powell have just arrived for my birthday party. And they've come from New York for my birthday party, my surprise party. And there's actually a picture in the book of the moment I see General Powell, and my head is buried into his shoulder and in a big bear hug. So that crazy week of UN, he actually has come to my birthday party. But the chapter goes on, and I say it's joy and sorrow because the joy, of course, is that joyous day of February 5th, 2003, and my surprise party and all the wonderful things. And then the sorrow is just the devastation of that the UN. And I, again, trying so hard not to be subjective, trying so hard not to 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 analyze something that I don't have the academic background or the political background, policy background to debate it. But in the chapter, what I can do and what I did do is that I take direct quotes from him about the speech. And but I then close the chapter by saying, so, on the anniversary ever after, when, headlines always pop up saying, General Powell gave the speech and, 10 years ago on this day, General Powell gave the UN speech. So there's no way that every year we didn't face it again. But I can always try to remind him, but remember too that that day, actually, there was joy that day too. Um, and so again, that's how I embrace it in the book. But it's a chapter called Joy and Sorrow, just before the end. Um, but you're right. I mean, that's something that plagued him um, till his death. That it was something that if he could have changed it, he would have. Um, but it was not to be.
All
So
right. Well, great, Leslie. We'll just take a couple of short questions because I am going to ask you to do a short reading of
okay.
how to close your book events. Susan Rowan.
Did it ever occur to anyone that this information that he got from across the board, the intelligence agencies, was a setup so that he could be, because he had all the cachet and respect at the UN, that he could be the one delivering the message? I'm from Chicago. I, of course, think it was a setup for him, but I'd like to know what you think.
I That's interesting. I can't say that I'm surprised that might have been a thought that some people might have. I don't know that I would necessarily say agree. I would choose to be a little
Kinder?
kinder, and
Yeah.
I would not make that choice. But I will tell you this. So early on, bef so when Governor Bush was declaring his his candidacy, and he had named Dick Cheney as his vice president. And then, and again, before the election, he then in he then let it be known that he would ask General Powell to be Secretary of State. And they appeared, the three of them appeared together. And there was, it was big headlines and pictures and things. I do remember that there were friends of General Powell's, and I think this actually made the news. I don't think I'm revealing any secret, but there were friends of General Powell's who said, having done that, you now have a bullseye on your head. That, again, I reference him as the Elvis um, of popularity. He was the star, and by being the star, that put a bullseye on his head.
All right, question from Mike Milstein. Unmute, Mike.
Enjoyed your talk very much. I'm kind of curious, who do you think he would have supported in the current presidential election?
Well, there's no doubt it would have been Vice President Harris.
Okay.
Right.
And anyway, I'll leave it at that.
I think that's best. Great. All right. Any other hands? Thank you. Oh, Carl Walsh.
Yes, I've often wondered, of course, Colonel Powell, I think he was a colonel at the time.
General.
Well,
Four-star
he
general.
was he ended up a general, but in Vietnam, he was there to investigate. Well, one of the things he did was to investigate the My Lai massacre, where he was given bad information and came to the conclusion that nothing happened, which of course proved to be wrong. I'm wondering, when they sent him into the UN after he had very vocally fought against the Iraq invasion, and initially didn't believe this information at all, did he ever have any feelings of, oh my God, here we go again?
Not that he expressed to me.
Okay.
And I don't know that I don't know that I was ever aware of even that as a discussion point, even around him. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
All right. All right. Any other hands? Oh, I'm going to ask Leslie if you would like to conclude what has been a great presentation. Can we just show our enthusiasm? Thank you, Marshall, for joining us. We'll see you in August. We'll be in touch. And Derek Arden zoomed in. He was on a train in England. So Leslie, when she concludes her library presentation, she's closed with a reading. So I suggested that might be a great close for our program. So
Okay.
over to you, Leslie.
All right. So this is how I conclude the book. Once, many, many years ago, General Powell had asked me to say his name, and although I knew he was giving me permission to call him Colin, I responded with a smile saying which one, then proceeded to rattle off any of a number of official as well as cheeky ones. General Powell, the General, CP, GP, Uncle Jen, Bro P, Colin Baby, as a reporter friend of his called him, Poppy, as he was known within the family, and Sir. With a laugh, he gave up and didn't press it or mention it again. Nevertheless, he understood I knew he was giving me permission to use his first name. And I knew he understood that no matter how close we were, I would always give him a quiet deference for all he represented and had accomplished. One of the General's favorite singers was the Scottish singer Lulu, who made famous the song To Sir with Love, which was written by Don Black and Mark London for the movie of that same name starring Sidney Poitier. Although the lyrics of the song are written as if sung by a young schoolgirl adoringly to her teacher, my eyes tear whenever I think of the last verse. A friend who taught right from wrong and weak from strong, that's a lot to learn. What can I give you in return? If you wanted the moon, I would try to make a start, but I would rather you let me give my heart to Sir with love. By the time I fell into General Powell's world over a quarter century ago, I had long known right from wrong, and yet, by the way he lived his life, the example he set, he showed us all right from wrong, weak from strong, and so much more. If I could have given him the moon to go with his 4 stars, I surely would have. As a military leader and later as a senior statesman on the world stage, he had our admiration and respect. As a boss, a dear friend, and a surrogate father, he had my heart, and I will forever rejoice in being able to share the gift of his memory, his lessons, and his joie de vivre. To serve with love, indeed.
Absolutely wonderful. Leslie, thank you very much indeed. We will now close the recording on that great close. And then if there are any other burning questions,